Good morning. I'm Dr. Camille Hammond with the Cade Foundation, and I am so honored to introduce Dr. Richard Scott. Dr. Scott has been described as a fertility pioneer and a fertility rock star by his peers. He has published over 500 articles and started many practices, including the two major fertility programs that are part of the U.S. military, as well as I think about 15 through RMA, or Reproductive Medical Associates of New Jersey, which now has offices and affiliates as far as Spain.
As far as Spain, Evie, yeah.
He is responsible for so many of the insights and so much of the new knowledge that has led to improved outcomes for fertility treatment. So one of his colleagues said that there is not a single fertility doctor alive today that does not use in their practice some information and knowledge that Dr. Scott was responsible for, at least in part. So it is a real privilege to have you on this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes. And he just delivered the keynote address at the University of Maryland School of Medicine for their multidisciplinary grand rounds, the Elliott Spiegel lectureship. And Howard, did I?
Isidore Siegel, yeah.
Isidore Siegel lectureship. So thank you for being willing to come on and be interviewed today. So for those of you who are tuned in on either Instagram or Facebook, if you have questions, please send them in right now because we will answer them on the air. We're only going to be live streaming for about 20 minutes. So, and a number of people have already sent in their questions. So we're going to start with those. But if there's time, we will answer any additionals that are sent in. So let's get started. Dr. Scott, we've received questions from people on Instagram and on Facebook over the past week. And many of those people are going to be tuned in right now. And this will also stay on our Facebook page. So if you're watching on Instagram, make sure that you check us out on Facebook, cadefoundation.org, or facebook.com/Cade Foundation, if you want to see the video later on today. So let's just get started. Our first question came from someone who has the Instagram handle of Egg Whisperer. And her question was, if there will be a scientific breakthrough that will help women produce new eggs.
I think the work has been going on and fairly well known to develop a stem cell basis for producing new oocytes. There are a couple of groups in Japan who are leading the way, but there's work going on in the United States and in Europe towards this end. There are many challenges to that, but they're being overcome. I still think we're several years before there will be oocytes available from these stem cell lines or induced pluripotent stem cell lines. Mm-hmm. So we have a ways to go, but it will come. Mm-hmm. Whether that's 3 years or 10 years or even 15, I'm not sure. Mm-hmm. It'll be very important to generate a lot of safety data. Mm-hmm. But the progress has been exciting. There are live offspring in animals. And so real progress is being made.
So at some point, you do believe that we will have the ability to create new eggs using a woman's genetics?
I do. I think it's very clear that will be the case. The only word of caution, so that's hopeful, and everyone should pay attention to that. For people who are building their families now, it is something I would caution them about. They probably don't want to count on this being available anytime too soon.
I see.
I would love to be wrong, and it would be great if they were here sooner, but they're probably not going to be here. For people who want to build their family in the next 3, 5, 7, 10 years, it's probably not going to be available. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, for future generations, this is going to be real.
That's outstanding. And so kind of the next question would be, if we are going to be able to produce eggs, will we also be able to produce sperm?
Sperm in many ways will be easier than eggs. In reproduction, the workload, while the genetic contribution is equal, the workload is not equal. Eggs vastly provide energy and early developmental guidance and many things. And the sperm are in some way along for the ride for much of this. Okay. Urologists everywhere don't hate me. I promise we know that it's important and the genetic contribution is critical. So I think that the pathway to sperm will be faster and easier. And in fact, even in the stem cell work, the original animal work was all originally done with sperm and successfully.
So we're going to be putting a couple of these organizations that get sperm donors out of business in the
Well, we may change
next
their
generation.
business. Maybe they'll become experts in producing new spermatozoa from stem cells.
Ah,
It'll be a sophisticated process. It's not going to be on every corner in every medical office, but there will be, I'm sure, many options for good care, and patients will have access.
excellent. Okay, our next question came from someone who asked to remain anonymous, and they asked about testing embryos after they've been frozen. How can we test them so that they don't have to be thawed and frozen again?
Well, you can't test them while they're frozen, right?
Okay.
So if you have embryos cryopreserved, they're almost certainly stored in liquid nitrogen, which is minus 196 degrees centigrade, and they are even if they're vitrified, they're super dense. They're essentially solid, which means that you're not going to be able to go in there and manipulate and take out a couple of cells. You're going to have to warm them to be able to biopsy them again.
Understood.
If you have an embryo that's been frozen once and you warm it, biopsy it, vitrify it, freeze it again, and use it again in the future, there is a small decrease in the probability of delivery, but it's only a few percent. And so while I would never be satisfied with that, and as a clinician and an investigator, I would always want to do better than that, the reality is that information is important, and it usually is very important. It may be worth that very, very small risk to go through the warming, freezing cycle.
Okay, so that's
They shouldn't hesitate, really. If they need the information, they need it. And that's a lot for them to go through than having to make embryos from scratch all over again. So sometimes it's a great option, and we do it almost every day.
so. My follow-up to that question is, what types of information can you learn from testing the embryo?
So we learn many things by testing embryos. The most important of which is just, do they have the right amount of genetic material? Are they going to be either a 46XX girl or a 46XY boy, which is great, or do they carry an extra or missing chromosome? Those won't make healthy children. The vast majority won't make children at all. Some of them plant and miscarry. A few, Downs, Turners, Edwards, etc., can make offspring, but they have healthcare problems. They have limits, and so the reality is that if we can screen an embryo in advance and determine that risk is exceedingly low, the average 42 or 3-year-old can reduce their risk to a level that's less than when they were 24. That's a benefit to the patient. So they simply may get pregnant more often. On the other hand, some people carry genetic disorders. Maybe they carry the disorder for cystic fibrosis or muscular atrophy or hemophilia. I mean, there's many things, thousands of things. And if we know they're at risk, we can screen their embryos to make sure that they do not have the abnormality. There are a variety of other things too, but the vast majority are for one of those two things, either looking at the wrong number of chromosomes, aneuploidy, to make sure that we get great outcomes and it's safe to do a single embryo transfer, or we're ruling out specific disorders, genetic abnormalities that parents are carriers for, which the child might actually be affected.
So would you suggest that everyone screen their embryos?
I would suggest that everyone screen their embryos. It's not essential. You can certainly do IVF without screening embryos. It's certainly not a requirement. But the lowest risk in any age group is about 20% of embryos are chromosomally imbalanced. That's a lot, and that produces miscarriages. Even if it's not to say 20% of babies will be abnormal, but if the embryos abnormally, they fail to implant, that breaks our patients' hearts. Or they get pregnant and miscarry, and that's even tougher on our patients. It makes us sadder and them as well. So if we can reduce that risk and improve outcomes and improve safety and do single embryo transfers and avoid all the complications of multiple pregnancy, that's pretty irresistible.
Understood. So another patient who goes by the name of Kelly said their clinic, and I will not name the clinic, said that if they use a donor egg and none of the eggs fertilize, or none of the eggs that are fertilized make it past the blastocyst, that they would be given another lot of eggs for free. But if genetic testing is done, then they will not provide another batch of eggs. So the question is, should they move forward with genetic testing? And the patient is saying, I'm almost tempted not to do the genetic testing just in case one of the eggs do not make it to the blastocyst stage.
There's some confusion here, not a lot, but a little. Let me see if I can bring some clarity to this. So, whether or not you get more eggs is a function of the egg bank. It's usually not the practice. They don't make that decision. They inherit that decision from the egg bank. And so, if there was a technical problem in freezing or warming, things might not go well, and they're going to replace those eggs for you. And that's ethical and appropriate, and that's good when egg banks do that. On the other hand, aneuploidy risk is beyond their control. It can be from the sperm, it can be from the egg. They don't control that risk. And because it's not their doing, it's not part of their process, they feel usually that they're not going to be responsible for that. The good news is that with egg donation, you almost always have some genetically normal embryos. So that's a positive thing there. If you don't do genetic testing until you have a blastocyst. So there's no such thing as not doing genetic testing so that you can get more free eggs. If you don't get a blastocyst, you get more free eggs. If you get a blastocyst, you don't, and you need to get a blastocyst to do the genetic screening. Now, the higher the risk of genetic abnormality, increasing maternal age, the greater the benefit to genetic screening. Donor eggs has the lowest risk of all of genetics, as you get young, healthy eggs, and because of that, the benefit there is perhaps somewhat lesser than it is if you're 35, 40, or 45. And so if they don't want to do it, egg donation is certainly acceptable to do without doing genetics. But it still does raise rates and lowers miscarriage rates and allows people to conceive more quickly. Our advice to our patients is normally that we never want to transfer an abnormal embryo. It only leads to sad things. And we want to be as efficient as we can. But it's not really an issue of whether or not you're getting aneuploid, changing whether or not you're going to have eggs or get more eggs. It really doesn't affect it.
So I'm going to take a break from these questions. I see that we just got a question. Amy says, I'd love to know if he thinks testing of embryos will be done in the same way that we do PGTA now.
Well, testing of embryos is PGTA. In our field, these technologies, they keep changing the name for them. So there's been a lot of different names over the years, CCS and PGS and PGD and PGTA. Now there's PGTA, PGTM, PGTS. I won't bore you with all what the acronyms stand for. But the most common genetic screening, almost all of it that is done, is PGTA, pre-implantation genetic testing, that's an embryo, for aneuploidy, that's the A. So when I'm talking about having too many or too few chromosomes, that is PGTA. And the vast majority of what's done to screen embryos to make sure they're safe and healthy is PGTA.
Okay, great. Okay, moving on, we've got another question that was submitted online. Why has infertility increased over time?
We actually know. There's a very direct answer to that. And it's just that as our society has advanced and we've become more sophisticated, people delay their childbearing. They have careers, they go to school. Look at doctors, they go to school forever. And so that's true in many, many fields. And because of that, their risk for that delaying conception raises your risk for infertility. The federal government has done a series of studies called the National Survey of Family Growth. It's been going on since the late 50s. And those data, which show certainly that the risk for infertility has increased dramatically, have demonstrated that if you simply control for the age of the female partner, it hasn't changed at all. It's just the same as it was in the 50s.
Mm-hmm. Okay, all right, so we're going to, I see that same person has submitted another question. We're going to move on, and if we have time at the end, we'll come back to them. So the next question is it possible to design a baby and pick hair color and eye color and other things? If not, when will it be possible? So
it is not possible to make a designer baby. It is. You can select for certain traits that are very well characterized, but I'm not aware of any clinic that is doing that. It's a matter of just elective for hair color, eye color. Perfect pitch would be an example. 3 genes control that. Part of the problem is that if you really want a child who runs fast or is tall, it's controlled by many, many genes. So to get that right, that perfect combination, how many embryos might you need to test to find that smart child who runs fast? Might take thousands, might take tens or even hundreds of thousands. And no one has that many eggs. No one has that many embryos. So even though we can test an embryo and tell you what's going on with those genes, we can't do anything about it. Altering the genes through gene editing, which is something that can be accomplished now by a number of different vehicles, most famously or most widely known as something called CRISPR-Cas9, is not something that's being done clinically yet, and we really do not know the safety. A lot of attention has been given to a couple of pregnancies in China where they reduced the risk for HIV in the child by giving it a certain gene that would be present and turned on. Is not the same thing as correcting for all these traits. And people should certainly not be thinking of IVF as a vehicle for creating a more idealized offspring.
Aren't CRISPR machines available on Amazon?
I don't know. You can buy almost anything online nowadays, but CRISPR is an enzyme actually, and Cas9 are an enzyme,
Okay.
and there are systems that can do it. But being able to do it with an embryo, the problem isn't just that you go in and affect one gene. It's afterwards you've got to put the ends back together. If you take the DNA strands and you cut them, take out something bad, put in something good, now you've got to reattach all that. That's not easy. And then what if you, instead of just changing that one place, that one base pair out of over 3 billion, what if you actually change the DNA in 10 places or 100 places or 1 million places? Not probably 1 million, but those are called off-target effects. So you may fix one thing and break 10 others. So the safety of this has not been established. It's being studied. It's particularly interesting for people who have mitochondrial disorders. I won't bore you too much with those. Thank goodness they're relatively uncommon. But in terms of using those things to try to create what someone might consider a more idealized child, that's not close. And there's really not a great deal of interest in the scientific community in pursuing that kind of care. We're here to give everybody a chance. We're here to give everybody an opportunity to have a healthy baby. After that, nature takes its course and we should stay out of it.
So for those people who would come in and say, I want a baby who has this feature. I want a baby with red hair, even though my husband and I both have blonde hair. That's not something that your clinic or that most clinics at this point would be comfortable with.
That would require gene insertion. I'm not sure there's any clinic capable of doing that yet. But even if we could, because I have wanted to develop the capability to prevent some horrible disease,
Yes.
And then produce a healthy baby, that would be awesome. I would not be willing to, nor do I know any responsible physician who would be willing to do that for something like hair color or eye color.
Okay, great. So we've got another question that was submitted in advance, and then I'll go to some of our online questions. This question comes from another anonymous person who asked to remain anonymous. Who decides what should be done even if things are possible? Even if things can be done, who decides if they should be done?
So it varies widely. The federal government has rules and regulations, statutes, and every country sets limits on what can and can't be done. In places like England, there's something called the HFEA that makes decisions about virtually every technology. In the U.S., they have left it up to the discretion of patients, believing that patients themselves ultimately determine their reproductive rights, something I strongly agree with, and only certain things that they feel really are out of bounds. Trading DNA and other things are specifically precluded, gene editing being one of them. I think that in the end, it's very difficult for a bunch of people and to go into a room and to sit and decide what someone else's reproductive rights would be. They may not fully understand the situation. And it's in the past, when doctors and bureaucrats have decided what people's reproductive rights might be, it has not frequently gone well, and they have made mistakes and hurt people. So, and at this time, it is a decision between the patient and the clinician and the scientist. Clinicians and scientists is a strong rule, are not going to do unethical things, and then patients do what's comfortable to them. It's a pretty good system.
But I know that many fertility clinics also have ethical boards that will help them decide about cases that would be controversial.
Our system is the largest in the world, but our ethical board is made up of people from outside our group. So we have representation on the group, but we get input from many different people in many different walks of lives, from legal people and business people and stay-at-home moms and dads and all kinds of people. So we bring as many perspectives as we can. And to be honest with you, most things we do are not very controversial.
Okay.
You know, can this safely increase the probability that someone's going to build their family and get a healthy singleton at home? Those are good things. Things that don't do that, probably not worth doing. So it's less controversial than you might think.
Understood. And then for our last question, because unfortunately we are at time, there was a clarification of a previous question answered. I'm not quite sure where that is, but we've got, do you think a man will ever have a uterine transplant?
No. At least I can't believe there would be an ethical reason to do that.
Okay.
So uterine transplants are complex enough as they are, and they can be done in certain circumstances. But I think that doing that into a male and a male pelvis and with all the hormonal issues and other things behind it don't make a lot of biologic sense. Whether or not our society will at some point say that the social need to do that exists and change people's minds is possible. But just because you can does not mean you should. And we have many same-sex couples, male-male couples, and they can use gestational carriers, and they get wonderful families, and they have great children, and it really goes well. Whether or not we need to try to alter so much biology and take so much risk when we have another good vehicle for family building for those individuals, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Okay, one final question. There's something called HLA-KIR. Is that testing going to be done?
So HLA-KIR, and very, very good. Someone is really up to date. So HLA-KIR has nothing to do with classic immune stuff, but it does have to do with the way certain proteins that are normally involved in your immune system, expressed on the placental-like cells, interact with the maternal cells, mom's environment, to determine how the placenta will form and blood supply is provided and many aspects of that. And it turns out that over a very, very long period of time, one type of stimulus from HLA and one sort of response from KIR were matched up. So what's called KIR-A went with HLA-C1 and KIR-B went with C2, and life was good. But now that we all travel around the world and we all have had kids with people from everywhere, we're starting to get mismatches. And those mismatches are an increased risk for low birth weight, preterm labor, pregnancy-induced hypertension, and miscarriage. And they are now also, through the excellent work of Juan Garcia Velasco in Madrid and Diana Alexandru, also in Madrid, have shown that those mismatches can reduce outcomes even in donor exit circumstances. So yes, and that screening is actively being done. And there's great value. Our group has published some papers on this and with many others coming. Yeah, right now it's not done routinely, but it probably should be. And I think will be part of the routine screening armamentarium in the next year or two.
So thank you everyone who's tuned in. Thank you, Dr. Scott. This was wonderful. I appreciate your time. I want to give you a Cade Foundation mug because the program that we usually live stream is Coffee with Cade, and we have coffee in the mug, and so thank you for your time. And for anyone who has any additional questions, please feel free to email them or include them on the live stream, and I will make sure that Dr. Scott gets a copy of those questions.
Great.
For everyone else, have a wonderful day. Thank you for your time. Be well, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for doing all this. It really helps people. Thank you.
Thank you. That was awesome. Thank you. Thank you, Amy.